All right. Good day, good evening, good morning to all of you out there. My name is Henry Dittmer. I'm with Agile for All. I'm an Agile coach and trainer. And today with me on the live stream is Richard Lawrence. Richard, you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Richard Lawrence. I too am an Agile trainer and coach with Agile for All. And I'm excited to be back on here. It's been a while since I've done one of these.
Yeah, so I'm actually very excited too. The topic for today is product backlogs. Of one of our foundation courses you can find on the YouTube channel if you haven't already viewed it. I'm really excited about the topic today because with me is Richard, who frankly, and I'll just put you on the spot, Richard, when I think about product ownership and product backlogs, my mind goes to, if I have a question, go to Richard. So I'm interested in finding out what I'm going to learn today about product backlogs. So where would you start? Where would you start with what a product backlog is and how do you get a product backlog?
Yeah. So I was just telling my product owner class yesterday that the funny thing about Scrum and product backlogs is that it's almost treated as a prerequisite. Like you look at a Scrum diagram, and typical Scrum diagram has like the product backlog at the beginning and then flows into all the rest of the Scrum things. And the sum total of the guidance that a product owner gets is make a good backlog. And it should be prioritized and the items on it should produce increments of product, but that's pretty much all you get. And so I think the tricky thing with product backlogs is that it's not really well defined what you should do, or at least how to do it. About the only thing artifacts like the Scrum Guide give us is some guidance of what it should produce as an outcome, but it doesn't really tell you how to do it. And this is why most Scrum teams use things like user stories as backlog items, not part of Scrum, but something that, a useful thing from extreme programming that can be pulled into Scrum.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting. We all know that the lifeblood of a Scrum team is a product backlog, right? If there's nothing that's up there for them to work on, is in a space or a context that they can work on it, things kind of stall in a hurry. So it is, I never thought about it that way, but that diagram, yeah, you're right. It starts with this thing that's supposedly already filled out.
Yeah, and then the magic happens.
Yeah, and then the magic happens, right?
And you're right. If you get the backlog right, you have a decent chance at delivering a product that matters. No matter how skilled your team is, if you don't have a good backlog, you're going to be good at building the wrong thing.
Yeah. And in some cases, building the wrong thing very fast, right?
Yeah. And I've seen teams like that. I've been on a team like that where we got a good way into a product and we're really pleased with how good our engineering practices were and things. And we realized, wait a minute, nobody's using this thing we're building. And that was actually the thing that got me started focusing on product owner skills probably, 11, 12 years ago. I started out on the extreme programming side of the Agile world back in '99 as a developer and development lead. So I was really focused on engineering practices for a long time. And it was about 2008, I think, when I was coaching a team. And we realized after getting really good, 6 weeks of focusing on XP stuff, realized that nobody wanted the product we were building. and that led to my dive into, okay, how do you figure out how to build a product that people want and get that right at every level of detail, and led to the story splitting article and kind of me becoming the story splitting guy sort of by accident.
Yeah. Matter of fact, I just got done sending that guide to a client of mine, Richard. They were having troubles with that exact problem. They actually went to 6-week sprints because they couldn't get the stories done. And I was like, I think I have a guide that might help you with getting them small enough to get done. But let's go all the way back to the beginning. So I've got this thing I'm supposed to create in the beginning. How would you start? How would you suggest people start?
So you have no backlog? You have a new Scrum team?
Backlog, Scrum team, ready to go.
Yeah. I would not start by immediately making a backlog.
Cool.
I would start by trying to understand the customer and what they want to accomplish. Yeah, I think a lot of times we lead with what could we build and why is it so great and why are they going to love it? When we probably should be thinking about what do people actually want to accomplish? Because nobody actually wants our software. Not just our software, like anybody's software. Nobody actually wants software, even a game.
Hmm.
You want what it does for you.
Hmm.
You want what you get out of it. So I like this jobs to be done idea. Peter Green and I both build this with the customer profile explicitly into our CSPO courses, where we're going to think about the customer and what they're trying to accomplish totally apart from our product. And just think about what are their goals? What do they need? And then from there, we can start thinking about what things could we do that would help them achieve their goals. But if we lead with all the things we could do, we're just going to have a backlog that'll keep us busy, but may not actually meet the customer's needs.
Interesting.
What do you do at the beginning, or what do you help teams do?
Oh, it's a similar kind of thing. There's voice of the customer type of work that you can do, QFD processes and that kind of stuff. The bottom line is, the bottom line is that I really very much want to get an idea of what is the aspiration of the customer, right? The client. What would their life be like if they had the software? So it's a different way of asking the question and getting beyond just solving an immediate problem, but actually looking for that aspiration piece. We tend to focus on, if I had software to fix this thing, that kind of limits the scope, and in some cases can actually limit even the architecture we enter into thinking about. So what are we thinking about? What would be cool? What would be the magic wand type of vision statement?
Which is usually the most valuable thing you could do and the most complex thing you could do.
Mm-hmm.
I notice those are correlated, and there's a tendency for teams that don't intentionally go after the complex stuff to do a bunch of what one would call obvious or sometimes complicated things, the things we understand, the infrastructure, the frameworks, and you end up with the system that does all the obvious things. You can log in, you can do the most basic management of various entities, but you can't do that core thing that really would delight the customer, that would really add value. So I'm always encouraging teams to go after that new complex high value thing first and work your way back into some of the things that feel like maybe prerequisites.
Mm-hmm.
And my feature mining technique that I've taught at various conferences and in my classes is designed to do that. So we've got this big idea of what we could do. How do we hone in on that core increment of maximum impact and risk mitigation and learning from the beginning? So I'm doing a lot of that before I even create a backlog. That may only take a day or two. We're not talking about months of upfront work. Sometimes people ask me on day 2 of my product owner class, when am I going to find time to do all these things? Because we've done customer profiles and product vision and things like this. Like, when will I ever find time to do that? And so I walk them through totaling up the time we've spent on it. And like actual time building these for your first time ever while learning the tool was like 40 minutes to an hour at that point. So if you're so busy that you can't even find an hour to stop and think about the customer, something may be wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing I think it's interesting in this is that there's no reason the team can't do some level of sprinting to help inform what that vision is, right? Mm-hmm. So, getting something demonstrable, it may not, maybe throwaway, right? But it actually creates value in helping the customers, the stakeholders start to flush out that vision a little bit. I watch teams that'll spend, more than the 2 days, literally weeks, even months, trying to get it written down well enough, right? And conveying that through, standard type of requirements, documents, and so forth. There's nothing like a little bit of a working prototype or something to say, so is this what you're thinking about? Is this what, would this solve the problem? How would that work?
And a lot of times it doesn't have to be throwaway. It can be a real thing, just really thin. So I'm always looking for what is that core impact we're going for, or core risk you want to mitigate, or question you want to answer. And what's something small that we could build that would teach us that without taking on all the size and variations and scale and everything of the larger product. I think sometimes we let those things that we could do, things like scale, hold hostage, something that would be really valuable early on. I, for a long time, suggested kind of prototyping, just building something quick, and I found there's a natural aversion to rework, and I don't want people to separate in their head learning and building a product. because for complex product development, you learn as you build a product. And so that has kind of nudged me away from the idea of prototypes and proofs of concept and things like that, because I think because it feels like you're going to do the learning and then you're going to be done learning and now you just build the thing. Learning is something that you do separately and then throw away. And I want to build cultures on the teams I work with where you're constantly learning as you build the product, and you're just choosing what to build next based on what it'll teach you and why it matters to the customer. But I'm encouraging people to slice things smaller instead of keeping them big and building them crappier. Small and good instead of big and crappy.
So do you want to say a little more about feature mining? What is it like? What's the steps?
Yeah. So feature mining actually started out as an improvised focus conversation. So, you know, the focus conversation method where you do observation, reflection, interpretation, decision in order, something we often use for retrospectives, to get shared data before we start trying to make sense of it with questions like what worked and what didn't. So for several years, you know, I've been writing about story splitting. I guess 12 years now I've been writing about story splitting. And a few years back, I kept getting this question of, like, I see how I could build small increments once I have that first big release out the door, but I don't see any way I could start with something small. And so I wanted to solve that. And I happened to be coaching a lot at Whole Foods at the time. And they were kicking off a couple projects and wanted to figure out how to start small because they're really at the forefront of a lot of this agility stuff and recognized that was a key place to grow. But I didn't have a standard method to do it. I just kind of used my intuition from years of teaching this stuff, and didn't have a systematic way for groups to do it at the big kind of project level. So I just did what I always do when I don't have a structure for a meeting, and I used the focused conversation structure and started with, like, what facts do we need? What data do we need to start thinking about this? And I found there were really 4 things we needed to know about. We needed to know what impact we were going for. We needed to know what made this thing big. Like, what is that size we have to slice through somehow? We needed to know what was risky, and we needed to know what was uncertain. And so we started by just brainstorming around those 4 categories. And then for the reflection part of focused conversation, we kind of filtered it with some dot voting. So what seems most important in each of these. And then we started saying, how can I get some of this top impact without having to take on all the size? Like, maybe it's big because there's so many stores and every region calculates sales differently, and the impact we're going for is, you know, faster sales reporting with the stores or something. So how could we get some stores this information faster without taking on the scale of all the stores and all the variations? Well, like, what if we just pilot it for one store that we know is interested in this and just see what changes for them, start learning about it? So it's not a prototype. That would be a small feature that we would lead with, but it's real. You know, it's something that a store is actually using to change how they do inventory and promotions and make money in the short term. And then from there we can scale. But we were keeping the scale from holding that initial value and learning hostage.
Interesting.
So feature mining is just a systematic way to work through that. And I teach it in my 80/20 product ownership online course, in CSPOs and coaching as a prerequisite to our new advanced CSPO. So it's kind of all over the place except publicly on our website. It's like the only thing I'm not giving away for free right now.
So tell me more about risk versus uncertainty. What's the difference between those two? I heard you say that. I was like,
Yeah, they started out as the same question. The first time I did this, I would ask, where are the risks and uncertainties? And what I found is that we were better able to reason about them when we phrased the answers differently. So for risks, we're talking about what could go wrong and cause us to fail to get the impact we want. And we can think most clearly about risk when we phrase the risks as the thing going wrong. Like, we roll out this new report and the stores still only check it monthly instead of weekly. So we're describing the thing going wrong rather than just saying, well, adoption is a risk, which is hard to reason about. And for uncertainties, I found we can think more clearly about those when we actually write down the question we would like to answer. And it's like a Venn diagram. There's some overlap of, like, things you get when you ask about risk, things you get when you ask about uncertainty, and some things that come up both ways. And by separating them out and phrasing them 2 different ways, it allows us to really distinguish, is this a risk we need to mitigate, like something that could just happen to us? Or is it a question we could go out and answer with some kind of experiment or research or something? So making that distinction helps groups think more clearly about how to go about learning.
Cool. It's interesting. I was reflecting on the focus conversations and how it mapped to the feature mining. I don't think I've ever heard you do that connection before. So I am learning something. It's kind of like it's very similar to a what's called a Z process, where it's like get what is known in the room, so that we're kind of grounded in common understanding and a basis of the reality. Move to the brainstorming piece of it, right? So what's possible given all that stuff? Then go to the more analytical. So what choices can we make here? And then in the Z process, I'd be curious to have you reflect on this a bit, is I move to, so what does that mean from a values perspective, a human perspective, you know, the goals of the organization perspective?
Mm-hmm. Which is something that I've not built in explicitly to feature mining. I'm noticing, and this is explaining some of what happened yesterday in my CSPO class, actually, particularly that impact question, like the first thing we brainstorm around. I'm noticing that you get the best outcome when people are thinking in terms of what are these larger things we want to accomplish, and how does this particular project or product contribute towards those larger goals, and frame impact in those terms. And I noticed some groups, when we did this as a practice activity yesterday, did that more intuitively. Others required more nudging to go in that direction. But I think I was just doing it out of my desire for relatedness and making sure that the work connects to larger things that matter.
Right.
But I wasn't building it in explicitly in the process. And I could see how that would be helpful to even add some questions to prompt. And when we're talking about impact, how does this connect to larger impacts we want to have on the world as an organization, or larger things we care about?
Yeah, that'd be cool.
I like that. And I noticed here, this Z process sounds similar to the divergent convergent kind of model.
Yeah.
Meetings have. And so I think what you're seeing here is sort of describing the elephant from different angles. Is when humans collaborate effectively in meetings, certain things happen. and we see different aspects of that. And the more we can pull them together, probably the more effective decision making we get in groups.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I also think for some of them, there's a particular flow to it. It makes more sense for a human system situation, right? So very simply, very quickly, because we're diverging off of backlog a little bit here, but
that's how these things go.
But if you don't know, for some temperaments, for some types of people, if they don't know what's real, what is the data piece of the thing, and then we immediately jump to brainstorming, they can't participate in that because they're constantly going, yeah, but how do we know? So you get this jitter going back and forth. So that's kind of why I like that process. It takes a flow that works well for a group of people in the way people can participate effectively all throughout the whole thing.
And I think that's what feature mining does. It diverges and converges twice.
Yeah, it does.
Once around, what do we know about impact, size, risk, and uncertainty? And then focusing on what matters most in each category, and then diverging again on, okay, what's possible? How could we slice this smaller? And diverging down to the first feature, or converging rather, down to the first feature. So yeah, that sounds actually very similar.
Interesting.
And I think that's also what good retrospectives do, where you're beginning with what happened and making sense of that, and then you're generating new possibilities and making sense of and deciding on those. So there's that two pass thing again.
Yeah, same thing about a 5 whys conversation, and followed by a what if and how might we kind of format. You see a lot of similarities across all this thing. So back to the product backlog, though.
Back to the backlog.
Yeah. So we've had a great conversation with the business. We know what their aspirations are. We know what their needs are. What problem do they want to have solved, or what kind of value they want to create, have provided to them as a result of software. What what do you do next? How do you now start to fill this thing in?
Yeah, I like to get to a minimum marketable feature at the outset, an MMF. So something that's actually going to have an impact. I use the analogy of the minimum effective dose of a drug. Like, take enough Tylenol to make your headache go away, but not so much that your liver stops working. And so we want enough change that we actually have a business impact, but not so much that we get side effects like delays and cash flow problems and going too far without feedback, things like that. But those are still too big to land on a backlog and get pulled into a sprint. So we need to split those into something like user stories, which is my favorite thing for backlog items at the top. And so I would use my story splitting patterns for that sort of thing. So let me grab this for it. And since there's probably somebody watching who's been under a rock for the last decade and hasn't seen this, like, go to agileforall.com/splitting-user-stories, and you can download this flowchart about how to split a user story, which also works for how to split a feature into stories and walk through that thing systematically. And in particular, I would encourage people to check out the workflow pattern. I did a video for my 80/20 product ownership course that I actually give away for free as the taster that explains why most people split workflows wrong. So a lot of these big features to get started in business software have workflows to them. And the most obvious way to split a workflow is left to right. We'll do step one, we'll do a little more, we'll do a little more, right? Working your way through it, which defers learning and value as long as you possibly could. So, and a lot of people recommend splitting workflows that way. It is not just something people do by accident. It's something experts say, well, that's an easy way to split this. It is, but it misses the point, which is we want to learn. We want to build things that matter early. So on that poster and on that video, I talk about two and a half other patterns that work better. So you get down to stories, and then you get small things you can pull into a sprint and deliver.
Cool.
And I like to see 6 to 10 per sprint.
Stories in a sprint.
Yep. So how do you know they're small enough? Well, could we do 6 of these? It's probably small enough.
You know, I've been using a concept of a story of stories in the backlog.
What does that mean?
So if you're trying to build a project, right? So it's typically not, it's like a ground start. I don't have something and I want to build something at some time. What's the story that the backlog is going to tell me by virtue of the stories that are in the backlog, right? And can you express that in a way that makes me want to read that backlog? I often talk about books, right? Okay. If you pick up a book and it's simply had in the index chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, and it's a 1,200 page book, there's not a lot of excitement to pick that book up, right? But if chapter 1 says, you know, the hunt, right? Chapter C says the find, right? Something a little more teasing. And I want to pick it up and read chapter 1. And if I'm getting enough value, I'll read up to a point of that, and then I might put it down. Books even these days, it's not that long of a invention. Even chapters, if you read a book, will have breaks in them, right? They have big white spaces in them or little subtitles. It's the way I think about organizing a backlog that tells a story, right? So if my stakeholders can look at that, I should be able to express how are we going from nothing to something over time. And they could choose to skip pieces of a chapter if they want to then, or they can choose to rewrite the story going forward. You know, I don't like the ending, or I don't like the middle part of the plot or something like that.
Do you use story mapping or something like this to organize that? Or is it something you're just kind of reading over a backlog?
Yeah, you know, there's various techniques. I think that the concept is a very macro level concept, right? Of a story of stories. How you arrive at that, whether it's story mapping for something like a business process, or whether it's frankly just structuring a product with its various, you know, feature components and how much of each feature and so forth is irrelevant, frankly, from a story of stories perspective.
Yeah, I could see reading even a list of MMF titles.
Yeah, very similar.
I would structure it at the top level. And that really should tell that story of kind of the growth of the capability of the system and therefore the benefits to the user.
Yep.
Like in the beginning, they're going to be able to do this small thing, but it's going to be meaningful to them. They're going to have kind of a small success. And then it's going to build up to this larger and larger capability for them over time.
Yeah, the other thing I think that I found that it does is for particularly organizations that are constantly being interrupted with, the next shiny thing or some kind of an interrupt, right? When I can tell a story of stories, the stakeholders are now engaged in a way that it's like they make a choice whether they want to put the book down, if you will, right? Or is the book compelling enough that I really don't want to chase the new shiny thing? So it helps with that negotiation, if you will, about where are we going to focus the team next.
Right. And the other thing I like about this is that nobody wants to read one of these books that takes 100 pages to get moving.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So the metaphor is really nice there, where you can look at the backlog and you can see like you're doing the intro of this story and explaining all these characters and doing all this for the first 100 pages. Nobody's going to want to keep investing in this thing.
That's right.
And how can we sort of jump in the middle of the action, which is what I'm using feature mining to do. Mm-hmm. So it's one of those books where they have the memorable beginning. I think of a lot of these classics that start out with some really evocative scene. Something is happening. And we even remember some of these, like the opening of Moby Dick is the best part of the story.
Yeah.
And I think we can do a similar thing in a good backlog where that first feature, if maybe even goes to production and has an immediate impact and gets people excited about the rest of the story.
It creates that compelling reason to continue, right? It creates that. The other thing I think that's kind of fun with it, although I'll be honest with you, people lose me at some points in time in this, but you can also start thinking about them as a chapter book, right? Which, remember, my kids just love those, because a chapter book, from my definition, was I'm reading along and I get a point in the book and I can choose to go down path A, B, or C.
The choose your own adventure books.
Yeah, that's a very similar, that's another term for them.
Yeah.
So, now people begin to appreciate what the flexibility and the refinement and the fact that you don't create a backlog up at the beginning and expect it to stay static throughout an entire project. In fact,
let's talk about that.
Sure. Yeah. So what do you have to say?
So let's talk about some ways backlogs go wrong.
Cool.
And I think you raised one, which is, well, I guess there's a couple of variations. There's the too long and too detailed backlog.
Yeah.
Even if you expect it to change. So I'll pull classes sometimes and I'll ask, how long is your backlog? Like, if you stopped adding to it and let the team work through it, how long would it take
to get through it?
What do you think they say?
Probably, it depends on the size of the organization, but I wouldn't be surprised with a year or even 2 years.
Yeah, 2 to 4 years is the average. I had a 6-year one the other day. So then I'll ask, how much of your backlog will never hit the top? Something will always jump in ahead of it, or by the time it hits the top, it won't be recognizable as the same thing.
That's probably the 80-20 rule.
Yeah, and it's 60 to 80% in most places. I'll occasionally have somebody say, I've got a 6-year backlog and only 10% is going to change. So you are in for a world of pain, my friend, because that cannot possibly be true. So people make backlogs that are too long, and either they're just wasting a bunch of time on low priority things that they're refining and throwing away, or never actually throwing away, just jumping over, or they are really expecting it to be like a project plan. Like, we've mapped out the whole backlog from now until the end of the year, and we're just going to work through it.
March. Yeah,
which never happens. I've never seen anybody disciplined enough to keep all learning and change out of their backlog for a whole release, which is good because you actually should be incorporating learning and change. But there's this dissonance where people behave like all change is additive, when reality says it's not possible.
Although I'll tell you, Richard, I have had clients that do that. They'll march all the way through accepting it, and then they'll get into the, bad term in my opinion, user acceptance type of testing, right? Following a more...
Which they batch up at the end.
Yeah, well, and so you run into, oh my God, wait a minute, why did it do this? Why did it do that? So by not allowing change, they actually incur cost, right?
So Another backlog dysfunction, the backlog that looks like a Gantt chart, where it's shaped primarily by technical dependencies. What do you suggest when you bump into these?
When I see one that's a Gantt chart?
Yeah, I mean, not literally a Gantt chart, but like the first thing has to happen before the second thing, before the third thing, and not because the top one is most important, but because it's a prerequisite for the next one. So it's all dependencies all the way down.
Yeah, it may be contrite, but I kind of go back to the whole MMF aspect, right? How am I creating value rapidly, right, that actually has an impact on the business, as opposed to creating all these dependencies that says I won't see any value until some longer period of time. Do you have other approaches?
I think one of the things I've found works pretty well is just going through the thought experiment of, if we wanted to do these in the opposite order, how would we go about doing it? And playing with some pairs where you've got something lower down the backlog that is kind of on its face more important than something further up, but feels like they're in dependency order, and just engage in the thought experiment with some team members. And just, if we wanted to do this. So not saying we should, not saying we're going to, just what creative things would we have to do to get this out of order? And you get things like, maybe they've got a create story before a read story on some entity, and the read one is going to teach you about the thing, and it's really what the user cares about, but it feels like create's a prerequisite. And so you do this thought experiment, and they may say something like, well, we could just stick some things directly in a database as a batch just for testing purposes, and then come back later and make it possible for the user to add one. Okay, how hard would that be? And so just play out that experiment a few times, and that tends to make it feel safer for the product owner to say, I really would rather have this other one first. But I didn't start with the product owner insisting on having it first, and then the team is kind of backed into a corner to make it possible. I started from just a playful, if we had to do this, how would we do it? And then it becomes an engineering problem to solve instead of a loss of autonomy.
Oh, very cool.
So that's worked fairly well. I mean, this kind of emergent design is hard, and it's not familiar to a lot of developers. They just kind of get thrown into it. So it does require practice.
Well, and most organizations have been trained to follow that kind of a litany approach to things. So freeing up that creativity, I think, is a key aspect of making an agile transformation real.
Yeah, it gives you options.
Yeah. Other patterns that you see poor backlogs?
What do you mean?
Are there other examples of poor backlogs, other situations?
So we've got long backlogs, we've got backlogs in dependency order. Another one would be backlogs that are full of things that aren't increments of value for the customer.
There you go. Yeah.
What I call coconut stories.
Now I have to ask, what's a coconut story?
Okay, so it's a reference to the cargo cult idea from anthropology, where after World War II, anthropologists rolled into some of these Pacific islands where the American military had temporarily had air bases and had compensated the locals with stuff. Like, here's some spam, literally. Here's some clothes. Here's various things to pay for our planes landing on your island. And so anthropologists came in to see what happens when you have these two wildly different cultures together for 3 years and how it changes things. Because it's historically a pretty unusual thing. Intercultural interactions previously are mostly about trade or colonization and more long-term. But this one was this kind of temporary thing where they were next to each other, but not really trading. And so they roll in and they find things like a guy sitting on a bamboo control tower with a full-size replica of a plane on the old airstrip, coconut headphones on his head, bamboo binoculars, trying to get the planes to come back. And anthropologists called this cargo cult behavior, like ritual practices to get the cargo to come back from the sky.
Right.
Which is a really human thing. This is a funny illustration of it. We do this all the time. Like, you see something that seems to work and you don't get it, and you copy what you see. Like the models on that ab roller commercial sure have good abs. I should probably buy one so I can have those abs by beach season. That's the same kind of cargo cult thing. And so I see people do this with that Connextra user story template, where they'll say, like, as a developer, I want a database diagram so I know what we're going to build in the database. that's not an increment of value for a user.
Mm-hmm.
That's a task pretending to be a story. So I call those coconut stories.
Interesting. Okay, never heard that.
So when you end up with backlogs full of coconuts, and these things that are going through the motions but not really actually increments of value, it's counterintuitive. Sometimes you have to put the coconuts back together to find better slices. Because the most common cause for this is I don't know how to split something into good stories.
Right.
So I split it into tasks and components.
Right.
Which means you have to reassemble those disparate parts to come up with a good story. So I did this backlog makeover ebook a few months ago that you can get on our website that just walks through for 2 weeks. Today, focus on this in your backlog, and here's a task, make it better for 15 minutes, and something like that every day for 2 weeks. And one of them is getting rid of the coconuts.
Interesting. I never thought about, I've heard of the coconut, I call it situation. I never thought about it relative to stories. There's consequences to all of this. As we know, it's an overarching system, right? And when you have a lot of coconut stories, the other thing I see is that you rapidly lose the stakeholders, right? They can't participate in this thing anymore. And right. You wonder why they get a little upset, or you see all the change at the end as opposed to, being compelled to show up at a review meeting early and adjust what it is we're building together.
Yeah, you've taken back all of the downsides of traditional waterfall style development while going through the motions of Agile. And in the same way, there's the opportunity cost when the guy's sitting on that tower with the coconuts on his head and it's not fishing or something. As you go through the motions of it, it's a pretty expensive way to do waterfall.
Yeah. So how do you keep this backlog fresh? How do you keep it current?
A little at a time every day. And I know this is another place where I'm a little unorthodox, because I believe you need a backlog grooming meeting like you need a programming meeting. It's just the work. And you need help from other people to do the work.
So you and I have talked about this in the past, because I take the more traditional approach, which is, have an actual ceremony as a crutch, if you will, to establishing that going on. Because I always worry about, that backlog is so darn important to the flow, to the journey the team is going through, that if people, it's kind of like doing your taxes. How many people do their taxes on April 14th, right before the deadline, as opposed
October 14th?
April 14th, right? Sorry, what did I say?
No, I said October because of the 6-month extension.
Gotcha. Right, yeah, exactly, right. As opposed to incrementally. So how do you tell people to plan for that? Because that's the comment that I keep getting is, how do I know that it's going to happen? How do I know that that I've got the capacity or the ability to do it?
I think a lot of teams are in a habit of overcommitting, and the Scrum Guide, I think, at some point, some revision of the Scrum Guide says this, and I still say it. Scrum teams should be spending, development teams should be spending 95% of their time short-term, 5% long-term, like looking ahead kind of stuff. Most commit to like 110% short-term. But when we're planning, we should be leaving space for not just getting the current work done, but also things like backlog refinement and looking at architecture and knowing where we're going beyond this current sprint. So part of it happens at planning, where you leave time for it, which would be on a 2-week sprint, 4 hours per person, which is a decent chunk of time. And then, I think of the daily Scrum as the time where the whole Scrum team's getting together to figure out, how are we going to collaborate today to make today matter? How do we get the most important things done today? And one of those things is being prepared for next sprint, having the backlog in good shape. So I actually like the product owner being part of this and speaking up and saying things like, I've got this big story that is coming up on the backlog in a couple of weeks and it needs to be split. And who's the right person to work with me on that today? Because I think most of the things we do in backlog refinement don't require the whole team. So you coordinate with the whole team, you self-organize around it, but really only estimating and committing to a sprint backlog require the whole team. Everything else can be done with smaller groups. So I'd rather see a lot of these small conversations and limited meetings. because nobody likes these big meetings.
Right.
You can hear this in a daily scrum where people say things like, Henry and I worked together on this thing, and then I went to this meeting. Meaning, like Henry and I were literally meeting.
Doing something, yeah.
But I don't call it a meeting because it was good. We got something done. I refer to the other thing as a meeting because we sat in the conference room and partially ignored each other for an hour with our laptops, and it's a different kind of thing. So I would rather reduce those and increase the continuous collaboration. So I tell product owners that sprint planning is like the sprint review is for the team to you. Like if they show up without an increment of product, that review is going to be painful. If you show up without a good backlog, that planning is going to be painful. And you both need each other to do your job well.
Yeah. So it's interesting, we started with the fact that the backlog, there's not a lot of training or description about how to do this backlog. And even in this conversation, we're seeing that people take different approaches to it, right? I think that the bottom line is to try something, experiment with it, and then look at how it's affecting that overall system. So I'm very much into the whole, if I have a crappy planning meeting because I have a poor backlog going in, well, there's your problem, right? What are you going to do about that? And maybe that means a backlog refinement meeting, or maybe it means more attention to capacity and the planning of the sprint for that kind of activity to happen. And your context better than anybody else does. So
yeah, all these things we recommend, even user stories, are just things we recommend because we've seen them work. But it's one of the things I like about Scrum is that it's so not prescriptive about this stuff.
Yep.
There are recipes and patterns out there, but you don't have to use them. And so my advice to people watching this, if your backlog's kind of a mess, just start at the top and clean up the top of it. Make next sprint a little bit better, and then buy yourself some time to make it a little more of it better, but don't feel like you have to fix it all in one shot. And something that can be useful, I do this with my paper inbox at home occasionally with all the travel. And sometimes I'll get a banker box and take everything in my paper inbox and drop it in the banker box and put that off to the side and declare inbox bankruptcy. And if something is really important, I'm going to dig it out, or I'm going to get another notice, or I'm going to pay a small fine or something. So you can do that with a backlog if it's a disaster. If you've got this thing in Jira that's like where your dreams go to die, it's okay to retitle that as like the old backlog that taught us how not to do a backlog, and then just start clean with the top and slowly grow it.
Very good.
Well, we're up to the hour here, Henry.
We are, and I got to tell you, as always, I appreciate talking with you and learning from you. It's always
likewise.
Always out. So, cool.
Well, tune in next week if you want more of this from whoever's lined up for the next Agile for All live stream. I don't even know. And just shout out for a few other opportunities coming up. In addition to all our normal public classes and things, we've got conferences coming up this summer. Like you can find several of us at places like Agile 2018. Of course, we're putting on our own Humanizing Work event coming up in 2 weeks for alumni of our classes up in beautiful Beaver Creek, Colorado, my favorite week of the year. So if you are watching this as somebody who's been in an Agile for All class, that really is our flagship learning event, and you should be there. Shortly after that, Peter Green and I are kicking off the first of our advanced CSPO program too. So lots of different things coming up as we get into the summer. And we would love to see a lot of you at those things.
Indeed. I echo all of that.
All right.
Very good, sir.
Well, Henry, talk with you later, and all of you people in internet land. See you soon. Don't hesitate to reply with questions and things you want to see us address in future live streams. Bye-bye.